It was a dark, moonless night. I was driving alone down a deserted highway. The road stretched out before me, a black ribbon disappearing into the distance. I was on my way back home after a long business trip, and I couldn't wait to be back in my own bed. As I drove, I felt a sense of unease. The road was completely empty, and the silence was deafening. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft swish of the tires on the pavement. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in a long white dress. She was looking down at the ground and didn't seem to notice my car. I rolled down the window, asking if she needed help. But when she looked up at me, I saw that her eyes were completely black. She didn't say anything, just kept staring at me with those eerie, empty eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly rolled up the window and drove away. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the back seat. But there was no one there. Just me, and the darkness. The highway was deserted, with no other cars in sight. I had the feeling that I was the only person for miles around. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made me gasp in horror. It was the same woman, standing in the middle of the road again. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop just a few feet from her. This time, she was looking directly at me, and I could see the emptiness in her eyes. She started to walk slowly toward my car, and I felt my heart racing in my chest. I tried to drive away, but my car wouldn't start. I was trapped. The woman was getting closer and closer, and I could see the details of her face more clearly now. She looked like she was in pain, and her hair was tangled and wild. Suddenly, the woman stopped in her tracks. She looked over my shoulder, as if she had heard something. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the empty darkness of the highway. And then I heard a soft whisper right next to my ear. "Get out of the car." I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. I was alone again, in the middle of the deserted highway. I tried the ignition again, but my car still wouldn't start. I started to panic. I was miles away from the nearest town, and I had no idea what to do. And then, out of nowhere, a car pulled up behind me. It was a black sedan, with tinted windows and no license plate. The driver rolled down the window and motioned for me to get in. I hesitated for a moment, but I was desperate. I got out of my car and climbed into the back seat of the sedan. The driver didn't say a word. He just drove, fast and reckless, down the empty highway. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was no longer alone on the dark, deserted road. But as the minutes ticked by, my relief turned to fear. The driver wasn't taking me to the nearest town, but deeper into the wilderness. The road was getting rougher, and I could hear the sound of gravel crunching under the car's tires. I tried to ask the driver where he was taking me, but he didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As we drove deeper into the wilderness, I began to feel like I was in a nightmare. The darkness was thick and oppressive, and the only sounds were the hum of the car's engine and the rustle of the trees. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. I looked out the window, and I saw that we had arrived at an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. The driver got out of the car and motioned for me to follow. I was too scared to protest. I got out of the car and followed him inside the house. It was cold and dark inside, with no electricity. The driver led me to a small room in the back where there was a table and a chair. He motioned for me to sit down, and then he disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. I sat there, my heart racing, not knowing what was going to happen next. And then I heard a soft whisper right behind me. "I told you to get out of the car." I spun around, but there was no one there. I was completely alone in the dark room. And then I saw something that made me scream. It was the woman in the white dress, standing in the corner of the room. Her eyes were still black, and her hair was tangled and wild. I tried to run, but the door was locked. I was trapped. The woman started to walk slowly toward me, and I could feel the fear taking over my body. I knew that I was going to die. And then, suddenly, everything went black. I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat. It took me a few moments to realize that it had all been a dream. But the fear lingered, and I knew that I would never forget the lonely road. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving alone down a deserted forest highway. The trees loomed over me, casting long shadows that seemed to move in the flickering light of my headlights. As I drove deeper into the woods, the rain started to come down harder. The windshield wipers were struggling to keep up, and I could barely see the road ahead. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made me hit the brakes. It was a figure, standing in the middle of the road. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it was completely still. As I got closer, I realized that it was a deer. But something was off. Its eyes were glowing a bright red, and it was staring right at me. I tried to drive around it, but the deer wouldn't budge. It just kept staring at me with those eerie, red eyes. Suddenly, there was a loud crack of thunder, and the deer bolted off into the woods. As I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rain was coming down even harder now, and the windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. And then, up ahead, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He was holding a lantern, and he looked like he had stepped right out of the 19th century. I slowed down, wondering if he needed help. But as I got closer, I realized that there was something off about him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken and dark. He beckoned me with a bony finger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to drive away, but my car wouldn't start. The man started to walk toward me, his lantern casting a flickering light across the road. I could see now that he was covered in cobwebs and dirt, and his clothes were torn and ragged. I tried the ignition again, but my car was completely dead. I was trapped. The man was getting closer and closer, and I could see the details of his face more clearly now. He looked like he had been dead for years, and he was reaching out to me with a gnarled hand. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning, and I saw something in the woods. It was a whole crowd of people, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes like the man. They were walking slowly toward me, with empty eyes and slack jaws. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, out of nowhere, my car roared to life. I hit the gas pedal and sped away, leaving the haunted forest road behind. But even as I drove away, I could still hear the sound of the people's footsteps, and I knew that they were following me. I drove faster and faster, but no matter how fast I went, I could never seem to escape them. And then, just when I thought I was safe, there was a loud thud. It felt like my car had hit something solid. I stopped the car and got out, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it, the old-fashioned lantern, lying in the middle of the road. I looked up and saw the crowd of people closing in on me. I knew then that there was no escape. The last thing I saw was the man with the lantern, his dead eyes fixed on me. And then everything went dark. There was a house on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for years. It was an old Victorian mansion that had fallen into disrepair, and the locals called it Willow House. They said it was haunted, that there were ghosts inside that would scare away anyone who dared to enter. But of course, there were always those who didn't believe in such things. One such person was a man named Tom, who was a YouTuber known for exploring haunted locations. He had heard about Willow House and decided it would make for a great video. He packed up his equipment and made his way to the house. As he approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. The house was even more foreboding up close, with its peeling paint and broken windows. But Tom pressed on, eager to see what was inside. He entered the house, his camera at the ready. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. He made his way through the living room, where the furniture was covered in white sheets. As he stepped into the kitchen, he heard a faint whisper that seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. Tom followed the sound to the basement, where he found an old Ouija board. He set up his camera and began to ask the spirits questions. At first, there was no response. But then, the planchette began to move on its own. The spirits identified themselves as the former owners of the house. They had been murdered by an intruder who had broken into their home. Tom asked if they were the ones responsible for the hauntings, but they denied it. They said there was something else in the house, something that was not of this world. Tom continued to investigate the house, but as the night wore on, he began to feel a sense of unease. He heard footsteps in the hallway, but when he turned to investigate, there was no one there. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck and heard whispers in his ear. Eventually, Tom couldn't take it anymore. He gathered up his equipment and ran out of the house, vowing never to return. But the experience had left its mark on him. He was haunted by nightmares and a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He tried to go on with his life, but the memories of Willow House lingered. He could still hear the whispers and feel the chill of the ghostly breath on his neck. And he knew that he would never forget the terror he had felt inside that haunted mansion.